Nissan just shook up the car world by announcing the 7th generation Nissan Z. And this time, it's called the Z? Strange naming aside though, the new Z is the most important sports car to come out of Japan in years. Because with the Toyota Supra's dubiously German heritage casting a shadow on its success, and the new NSX and GTR going far up market compared to their predecessors, Nissan is ready to go for the kill and finally take the throne after 50 years of close competition. But the history of the Z has been a rocky one with plenty of highs and just as many lows. So let's take a look at the evolution of the Z car to see if Nissan has finally learned from their mistakes, and if they've created a new Z that truly has a chance to be called the king of JDM. I'm Guff, this is Alban, let's get started. The Nissan Z now spans 7 generations of sports cars, but the story of that legendary lineage starts long before even the first generation Z hit the showroom. It starts with Datsun Sports. Datsun Sports was a series of roadsters made by Nissan in the 1960s to go head-to-head with Europe's finest, the likes of MG, Fiat, Alfa Romeo, and Triumph. The first car from Datsun Sports was the 1959 S211, named after the Datsun 211 sedan that it was based on. This was a sleek little drop-top that made an outstanding 36 horsepower thanks to a 998cc inline-4 engine. The car had fiberglass bodywork and was for the most part fully hand-built. That is, all 20 of them that they made. Despite the minuscule production numbers though, Nissan clearly saw some promise because 1 year later in 1960, Datsun released the SPL 212. The 12 meant that it had a 1.2 liter engine, which bumped power by 30%. That's 47 horsepower. The L indicated left-hand drive, which means that this was the first Datsun sports car to get imported into the United States. This was also the first car to don the FAIRLADY name. Yep, that same FAIRLADY that you know and love today, your mom. Where does FAIRLADY come from? Well, here's the story. You see, in the late 1950s, Katsuji Kawamata, the chairman of Nissan Motor Company, had traveled to the United States. And during his trip, he went to go see a famous Broadway show, one that was in the middle of its historic 5-year run in New York City. The name of that Broadway show was My Fair Lady. And that show left such a lasting impression on Kawamata-san that he decided he needed to go back home and tell everyone about it. He had an idea. If he could name a line of cars after My Fair Lady, then maybe the Japanese public would associate the success of that Broadway show with the success of his cars. I don't know if that really worked, but nevertheless, the SPL 212 went on to sell 281 units through 1961. Now, that was probably mostly due to the fact that they were using production lines now instead of hand building them, but nevertheless, it was an improvement. In 1961, the SPL 213 was released with a dual carb setup that made 59 horsepower. And then after selling about 213 of those, they stopped production to bring on the next generation, the SP 310. This second generation FAIRLADY debuted at the 1961 Tokyo Motor Show. And since Datsun Sports was going global, they decided to change the name in export markets to something simpler, the Datsun 1500 Roadster. The car was based on the Bluebird 310 platform, and it used a 1.5 liter overhead valve engine that made 74 horsepower in single carb trim and 84 horsepower in dual carb trim. In 1965, we got the SP 311, or the Datsun 1600. And this car came with independent front suspension, 95 horsepower, and an all-new design by the famous designer Count Albrecht Goetz. And Nissan had a hit on their hands. People couldn't get enough of the Datsun 1600. But in 1967, Nissan found a way to top it with the SR 311. This had a 2-liter U20 engine that put out 135 horsepower, and that was paired to a 5-speed manual transmission, which at the time was basically space technology. You could even get a competition pack, Eat Your Heart Out BMW M. This had dual Mikuni carbs and a special camshaft, and it put out 150 horsepower. That's honestly impressive even for today when it comes to a small lightweight roadster. But hold on, let's be honest. Why do we even care about any of these cars? None of these are Nissan Z cars. Well, here's the deal. Nissan was paying attention to the success of this line all the way back to the original SP213. And coincidentally, it was around this same time that YAMAHA, the motorcycle company, wanted to prove that they could do more than just bikes. So naturally, the two companies partnered on a project. This partnership resulted in Yamaha making the YX30 prototype, again with the design expertise of Count Albrecht Goetz. But the prototype never made it to production. You see, Nissan felt that the 2-liter engine made by Yamaha wasn't good enough and it didn't meet Nissan's standards. So Nissan scrapped the project and subsequently the partnership. Yamaha, understandably, was pissed, and they were still on a mission to prove their presence in the car market. So they took the YX30 prototype, left Nissan, and went straight to Toyota. Toyota took the YX30 prototype and ran with it, and it led to the creation of one of the most iconic Japanese coupes of all time, the Toyota 2000 GT. Yutaka Katayama, the then president of Nissan, saw the success of the 2000 GT, along with the success of other grand touring coupes like the MGB GT, the Opel GT, and the Porsche 914. Nissan's little Datsun Roadsters were doing well, but the GT market was quickly expanding and leaving the Roadster market behind. Katayama decided that Nissan needed a piece of this pie, and they needed to make a GT car. And so they got to work and created the Nissan Z.
High performance, the Datsun 240Z.
The first generation of the Z was the 1970 S30. The S30 was sold as the Nissan FAIRLADY Z in Japan, but as the 240Z in other markets. The goal was to bring a fresh, new, sleek design, along with modern technology and impressive performance, all for a low price. And the Z did exactly that. The FAIRLADY Z in Japan had a 2-liter L20 straight-six engine making 128 horsepower. And in the US, the 240Z got a 2.4-liter L24 engine that made 150 horsepower. The performance was pretty dang good, and it handled well too. And almost instantly, the FAIRLADY Z was a hit with the public and was quickly becoming Nissan's halo car. In the US, the Z was so successful that it broke the perception that Japan only made cheap econo boxes. In '71, the JDM FAIRLADY Z got new exterior and interior colors, and now it had Z badges instead of 240Z. Oh, and they removed these little vents from the hatch because people were inhaling the recirculating exhaust gases. Minor stuff. On top of those changes though, Nissan also released the FAIRLADY ZG, which was a Japan-only homologation special for Group 4 racing. The ZG model had a 2.4-liter engine, riveted on over fenders, an extended fiberglass front end, a rear spoiler, and acrylic headlight cover. This thing was straight up a race car for the road. We never got the ZG model in the United States, but Nissan wanted the car to compete in the US, and so they offered the extended fiberglass nose kit as a dealer option for 240Z owners. That wasn't all though. There was another Japan-only special called the Z432R. This came with a 2-liter S20 engine instead of the L series engine, the same S20 that was in the KPGC10 Skyline. And all of them were orange with black wheels and a black hood. It's safe to say that Nissan was on to something great with these Z cars, and they were really leaning into it. By the way, the Z432R is now considered the most valuable version of the Z car ever, with one selling in 2020 for over $800,000. In America, the S30 sold 45,000 units through the 1971 model year, and over 50,000 and 40,000 units in 72 and 73 respectively. The car was a success, but by 1974, the 2.4-liter version was discontinued in Japan because of the oil crisis. Strangely enough, for the export market, Nissan decided to up the engine displacement. 1974 Zs now had a 2.6-liter engine, and they had a nameplate to match, 260Z. It now came as a standard 3-door or a 2+2 coupe. The 2+2 had a nearly 12-inch longer wheelbase, along with larger quarter-panel windows and a notched roofline. The 2.6-liter called the L26 was a straight-six engine that made 165 horsepower in most parts of the world. But remember, this was the oil crisis, and so the US version at launch made 139 horsepower thanks to emissions regulations. But halfway through the model year, Nissan figured it out, and they managed to bump the American spec up to 165 horsepower. Nissan was on a roll here, and the very next year, in 1975, they introduced the 280Z to the United States. As the name suggests, the engine displacement was increased to 2.8 liters, and they added electronic fuel injection. The car made 170 horsepower and 163 pound-feet of torque and was quite the powerhouse for that class. And the 280Z, just like its predecessors, received a bunch of special editions. First was the 1977 Zap edition. They're all painted sunshine yellow with black stripes and red and orange chevrons. They only made about 1,000 Zap editions. Then in '78, they had the Black Pearl Special Edition. Named after its black pearlescent paint, this bad boy came from the factory with rear louvers, dual racing mirrors, and red and silver stripes. And there aren't exact production numbers on this, but it's estimated to be under 1,500 units. All in all though, the S30 chassis proved to be a huge success during its lifetime. But now it was time for the next generation of the Z. And so in 1978, Nissan introduced the S130 platform. We know it in the States as the Datsun or Nissan 280ZX, not to be confused with last year's 280Z. In Japan though, they still called it the FAIRLADY Z. Here's the thing though, in the late 70s, Toyota saw the success of the Z car and they wanted a little bit of that FAIRLADY pie. And so Toyota developed the Celica Supra to compete with the Z. The Celica Supra was more modern and luxurious and more of a GT car, and it made the 280Z look kind of old. And so Nissan's rebuttal was the 280ZX. This second gen car kept the same 2.8 liter L28 engine and 5-speed manual transmission, but that was pretty much the only thing it shared with the previous gen. The car was built from the ground up to be more luxurious in order to meet the consumer demands of that era. It had softer suspension, more sound deadening, comfortable seats, and it was even marketed with a high-end audio system at launch. The car now had McPherson strut front suspension and a semi-trailing arm rear, all packaged in a longer wheelbase than the previous gen. Here's the thing though, both the 2-seater and 2+2 models had a 50-50 weight distribution. And the new redesign focused a lot more on aerodynamics than the first gen. And what you ended up with was a more refined Z car that still went toe-to-toe with all of its GT competitors. And to show you that they were really getting with the times, Nissan released the first ever turbocharged Z in 1981. The 280ZX Turbo had the L28 ET that made 180 horsepower and 203 pound-feet of torque. And at the time, it was the fastest Japanese import on the market with a 0 to 60 time of 7.4 seconds with a 3-speed auto trans. It had a top speed of 130 miles per hour and ran the quarter mile in 16.6 seconds. It was so powerful apparently that Nissan didn't trust the 5-speed manual to be able to hold all that turbo torque, so it came as 3-speed automatic only. At home in Japan though, it was a different story. The turbo trim only got a 2-liter turbo engine, and that's because the 2.8 liter was considered too powerful to get approval from the Japanese Ministry of Transportation. And you're probably thinking that's ridiculous. I mean, the car only made 180 horsepower, but for the 80s, this thing was bonkers. And in 1982, it got a mid-cycle refresh, which had the turbo model hitting 60 in 7.1 seconds. For some perspective on how fast this was, the Aston Martin Volante did 0 to 60 in 8.9 seconds, and it cost 6 times the price of the Z. The Ferrari 308 GTSI did the same in 7.9 seconds. The only car with a faster 0 to 60 was the Porsche 911 SC, but with the Z, you didn't need to be a stockbroker or a dentist to own one. By 1982, the turbo model got a manual transmission option, the Borg-Warner T5, which interestingly enough was the same transmission that was in the GM F-bodies and the Mustang, making it the first Japanese car to ever have a non-Japanese transmission. Despite all this performance prowess though, the 280ZX still had its fair share of criticisms. On one hand, it was the fastest accelerating car on the market, one that competed far above its price range and even won Motor Trend's Best Car of the Year in 1979. But on the other hand, the car lost the rawness of its predecessor. It was commonly criticized as being too soft, too luxurious for a sports car. But regardless of what you thought of it, one thing was for certain: the legacy of the Z was just barely getting started. In 1983, Nissan went back to the drawing board and brought us the Z31. Here in the States, it was called the 300ZX, and in Japan, you probably already caught on by now, it was called the FAIRLADY Z. By now though, Nissan was phasing out the Datsun name and going back to just Nissan. So this was the Nissan 300ZX. Like previous generations, this Z focused on aerodynamics and increasing power. The chassis, however, was still based on the 280ZX with the same suspension geometry and wheelbase. None of that really made the news though, because the engine in the 300ZX was a big departure from previous Z. It was Japan's first ever mass-produced V6, as opposed to the straight sixes that had been in all of the Z's prior. Oddly enough, there was still a straight six option in Japan, the RB20 DET. Yes, the same engine that came in the Skyline. But everywhere else, we got a 3-liter V6 called the VG30. It came in non-turbo and turbo trims, with the turbo VG30 ET making about 200 horsepower. Truth be told though, none of this matters that much, because the Z31 was kind of just a footnote in the history of the Z. I think it's awesome, don't get me wrong. It was super 80s. It had digital gauges and G-force meters and all sorts of stuff like that. But overall, this car never got much recognition. Nissan did a lot with it, and there was a slew of special editions. The 50th anniversary edition, the Shiro edition, all these different engine options, but regardless, it was all forgotten to history. And that was kind of Nissan's fault, because the next generation Z had the same name, but ended up becoming a JDM legend. That car was the Z32. The only thing the Z32 carried over from the previous generation was the 3-liter V6. And well, since it was still 3 liters, Nissan called it the 300ZX. But now the VG30 had dual overhead cams and variable valve time, so it made 222 horsepower and 198 pound-feet of torque naturally aspirated. The turbo version of the Z32 was rocking twin Garrett turbochargers and dual intercoolers to the tune of 300 horsepower and 283 pound-feet of torque. This was a massive leap from the Z31. The new new design was wider and rounder than previous generations. And while it was initially criticized for not having the hard lines of the previous Z cars, the designers of the Z32 really saw into the future and captured that 90s aesthetic. This thing was, in my opinion, absolutely beautiful. And it was seriously futuristic in its design too. This was one of the first cars to ever be designed in CAD, or computer-aided design. And they had to use a supercomputer, the Cray 2, that was as big as the car in order to do it. And in classic Nissan Z fashion, this car came with a lot of revolutionary technology centered around the driving experience. The twin-turbo models came standard with adjustable multi-mode suspension and four-wheel steering called Hi-Cast, the same one that was in the Skyline. And all this tech wasn't for nothing. The Z32 won Motor Trend's 1990 Import Car of the Year, and it won Automobile Magazine's Design of the Year, and ranked in Road & Track's 10 best cars in the world. And then Car and Driver even added it to its 10 best cars list. The Z was well and truly on fire, and with the Z32, Nissan announced that they had sold 1 million Z cars in the United States. By 1993, aftermarket convertible conversions had become so popular that Nissan decided, well, let's do one from the factory, and they released a drop-top Z for the first time ever. They were kind of ugly though, so we don't really talk about them. And in 1995, Steve Millen Motorsports, aka Stillin, partnered with Nissan North America to create the 300ZX SMZ model. For an extra $14,000, Stillin stiffened the suspension, upgraded the brakes, and then piled in boost to make 365 horsepower, all backed by a factory warranty by Nissan. But despite the massive success with this car, and it really was a massive success, it was still a 90s Japanese sports car. And we all know what happened to the 90s Japanese sports cars. The rising yen to dollar ratio and the consumer trend of wanting SUVs was just too much for the Nissan Z to survive in. The Z32 started off as a $30,000 car in the US, but by the end of its run, it cost near $50,000. And so, the Z died off in most of the world in 1996. In Japan, it lived on for a few more years, and the 1998 Japanese model saw a bit of a mid-cycle refresh with a bunch of modern amenities and BBS wheels. But in 2000, alongside all of its JDM sports car brethren, it died. And for the first time since Datsun Sports, Nissan didn't have a Z car on sale. Now, that didn't mean Nissan was giving up on the Z. Nissan actually launched a restoration program for 240Zs, where they would buy 240Zs from people, restore them, and then sell them at their own dealerships. It was cool for sure, but it wasn't a new Z. And then in 1999, Renault purchased a 44% share in Nissan, and Carlos Ghosn became COO. That same year, Nissan revealed a new concept called the 240Z concept. It was a bright orange two-seater that had unmistakably Z styling. The 240Z concept was a fully functioning car with a KA24 2.4-liter engine in it, the same one out of the Nissan Silvia. And thank the Lord that that car was axed, because in the end, all it was a Nissan Silvia with a body kit on it. Certainly not something worthy of being a Z car. In this new age of Nissan restructuring their business, it was clearly apparent that a new Z just wasn't possible. That is, until 2001. When Carlos Ghosn was appointed to CEO. And Ghosn got in front of reporters and said these words: "We will build the Z and we will make it profitable." And that's exactly what Nissan did. The new and improved Z concept car made its debut at the North American International Auto Show. It was bright orange, again, for some reason, but this time the car came with a promise. And the promise was this car was real, and they were targeting the Porsche Boxster, all for a price of under $30,000. Now that sounded promising. And in the summer of 2002, Nissan delivered with the 350Z. It was powered by an all-new 3.5-liter VQ35 V6 engine. Now, it was all new for the Z, but this engine already existed in the Japanese Skylines and Pathfinders, and it made about 287 horsepower and 274 pound-feet of torque. Not bad. Pricing started at just under $26,000 in the US, which was even below their target MSRP. And to make sure they satisfied everyone, the car came in 5 different trim packages: Base, Enthusiast, Performance, Touring, and Track. The Base was a full-on stripper model. No LSD, not even any traction control. But the Track Edition 350Z, well, that was the sweet spot. It had Brembo brakes, cloth seats, a viscous LSD, and the rear spoiler. And with all of those options, the 350Z was extremely well received. It was a fantastic, affordable sports car, something that Nissan desperately needed to improve its brand image in that era. In 2004, Nissan released a Roadster model for your mom with a retractable soft-top roof. We don't talk about that one either. But for the 2005 model year, Nissan released the 35th anniversary 350Z. This commemorated 35 years of the Z being on sale, all the way back to that first 240Z. Initially, they were all automatic, but Nissan changed that pretty quickly. And these cars came with the VQ35 rev-up engine, which made 300 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. And it was paired to a 6-speed manual transmission called the CD009. This motor was pretty dang good, and the CD009 ended up becoming famous for being one of the strongest modern 6-speed manuals that you can get. And the rev-up engine was so well received that by 2006, Nissan put it into basically every single trim of the 350Z. In 2007, Nissan revised that motor and it made 306 horsepower and 268 pound-feet of torque, thanks to a higher redline and a more linear torque curve. In 2007, the track edition was dropped in favor for the Nismo edition. Nismo stood for Nissan Motorsports, and this version kept the big brakes and raised wheels, but added on a full body kit and exhaust system. Overall, the 350Z was just a good sports car, and it had plenty of success in motorsports to back that up. The car took wins in the Grand Am Cup, first place in the GT500 Championship, and won multiple GT300 championships. And by 2012, there was an entire Spec Z class that allowed every trim of 350Z to race. Strangely enough though, the most interesting 350Z accolade came after its production run. The 350Z resulted in 143 deaths per million registrations, making the 05 to 08 model year Z the most deadly car in the United States, just inching out the Nissan Titan. Yeah, that's a very telling statistic. But by now, the Z33 350Z was a thing of the past, because on December 30th, 2008, Nissan announced the Z34 370Z. The Z34, known as the FAIRLADY Z in Japan, of course, was another completely new redesign of the car. Although it looked pretty similar, the 370Z's wheelbase was shortened by 4 inches. The car's width was increased by 1.3 inches, and the car's roofline was lowered by almost half an inch. And add to that the fact that it was now powered by the 3.7-liter VQ37, which made anywhere from 328 horsepower to 350 horsepower depending on market and trim. 0 to 60 was handled in just 5.1 seconds, and it could be had as a 6-speed manual or 7-speed automatic. And in order to save weight, they changed to an aluminum hood, aluminum hatch, aluminum doors, and even an aluminum front subframe, all while still increasing the chassis rigidity compared to the 350Z by 22%. All of these were pretty serious improvements over the 350Z, and it showed. There was even a Nismo model on release, which made 350 horsepower and 374 pound-feet of torque, thanks to a revised ECU and exhaust system. The Nismo was only available with a 6-speed manual, and it had automatic rev matching, which was pretty astounding for the time. Very few other cars had that. And over the course of its lifetime, it saw a number of special editions, like the Yellow Edition, Black Edition, the Nürburgring Edition, the 40th Anniversary Edition, and so on and so forth. Other than that, Nissan never really changed much with this car. It was as if Nissan just forgot the car existed and just kept making them and kept selling them. Considering the state of Nissan's business at the time and all of the controversy around that, it seemed like the Z was just waiting for its turn at the chopping block. And in 2020, the Z34 finally met its fate when Nissan announced that it would be going out of production. Now, there were rumors of what was coming next, but whatever it was, it needed to be something novel, something fresh. And then in March of 2020, 2 trademark logos were filed by Nissan. One was its corporate logo, which is whatever, but the second trademark, well, this one was for a new Z logo. And oh boy, did the rumor mill start turning. The internet was ablaze with whispers of a new 400Z, one that was coming to right the wrongs of the 370Z before it. But there was no real news from Nissan. And then in May, Nissan released a 1-minute commercial showing off their new lineup of cars for the next year. And in the very last second, there was a glimpse of that unmistakable shape. It was a Z, and it paid some serious respect to the original 240Z design. At this point, the car world was going crazy in anticipation for a new Z, and by September, Nissan revealed the Z prototype and set the car world on fire. This was it, finally, a new Z, a real one, and Nissan was making some big promises. Chief of which was that it was here to spank the new Supra and show the world that they didn't need outside help to make a killer Japanese sports car. Fast forward one more year to August 2021, and Nissan finally showed us what the production Z was going to look like. Compared to the prototype, it was pretty much the same, save for a redesigned front grille, a rear spoiler, and some parking sensors. But the one answer we were all waiting for was that of the engine. And considering Nissan's history of naming cars after their displacement, the idea of a 400Z was pretty exciting. But in the end, Nissan broke their own rules. The new Z is just that, the Nissan Z. And of course, it isn't getting a 4-liter engine, but rather the 400 horsepower 3-liter VR30 engine, one that we've already seen in the Infiniti Q50 and Q60 Red Sport. And perhaps most important of all, the new Z is coming with an option of a 9-speed automatic transmission, or, joy of joys, a 6-speed manual gearbox. Eat your heart out, Toyota Supra. Nissan was setting up the Z to be not only fully Japanese, but to be a real driver's car. But It's not all so rosy though. While Nissan claims that a significant amount of this car is changed from the previous Z34, for some strange reason, this Z still retains the same chassis code of the 370Z, Z34. So it begs the question then, is this just a 370Z underneath, chassis, suspension, and all? There's really no way to know for sure, but the car is expected to launch in the spring of 2022, and I, for one, am excited to find out. Either way though, Nissan is bringing us something special, something with a modern power plant, retro styling, and above all, gears we can row ourselves. Something truly worthy of the Nissan Z name. The Nissan Z story is a long one, and one that is far from over. Nissan has a real opportunity here to pull from half a century of Z heritage and bring the Z car into the future. And even for a Nissan hater like myself, I can't help but give them their due respect for thinking of enthusiasts in a time where so many others have left us behind. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys later.